In this presentation, we're going to be looking at the effects of sin. Now, the sins that we're going to look at are the kind of three categories of sin that we have talked about before: original sin, mortal, and venial. Now, original sin is not a sin that is committed, it is a sin that is inherited. Adam and Eve, when they committed the original sin in the fall, had three major effects. First, the loss of supernatural grace. They were created in a perfect state where they had supernatural grace, sanctifying grace. When they committed this sin, they lost that grace. They rejected sanctifying grace and charity within them. In doing so, they turned themselves completely against God and thus incurred the debt of eternal punishment, that is, damnation. In addition to that, not only did they sin against God, they sinned against themselves, and in doing so, they wounded their own human nature. Whereas they were created perfectly ordered, now they've kind of injured themselves. And so the effects of this are ignorance, meaning our reason is darkened and we no longer seek truth as we should. Our malice means our will is darkened. We no longer seek the good as we should. We are weak now. So our passions, which are usually drummed up within us to be able to be courageous and to avoid what is evil, are now weakened. And then finally, we have natural desires and inclinations for what is good within us. However, those have been darkened. And now we have this kind of opposite desire to do what is evil and destructive. And all of this kind of culminates in the disordered passions. Adam and Eve were created with their reason completely subject to God, and our passions in the body completely subject to reason and the soul. But when they sinned, all of that was broken. The passions were completely disordered and unbridled like wild horses with no one to control them, and the reason is weak in being able to control them. Finally, there were the loss of what are called preternatural gifts. Adam and Eve were created in such a way that their body, even though it was still a material body, was not meant to decay and was not meant to die. However, now weakness has entered and the human body decays, it becomes ill and sick, it experiences pain, and ultimately death. Now, all of this is inherited by every human person. No human person is born pure or without the effects of original sin, with one exception that you may have learned about in the Immaculate Conception and thus Jesus Christ. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, mortal sin. Should someone receive baptism, which does take away some of the effects of original sin, there's still mortal sin, in which, with mortal sin, like original sin, there's the loss of sanctifying grace and charity. The person has rejected God, turned themselves away from God. And in doing so, in losing sanctifying grace and charity, they also lose the virtues, which means they are no longer able to, in an orderly and consistent way, do what is right and good. They also lose the gifts of the Holy Spirit, which means they no longer have the ability to receive in a natural way those promptings of the Holy Spirit to do what is right and good. Finally, by turning away from God, they incur punishment. First of all, the debt of eternal punishment, that is eternal damnation, hell. But if that's forgiven, there's still the debt of temporal punishment. We've attached ourselves to sin so much that even if we're forgiven of this, we still have work to do to detach ourselves from that sin and reattach ourselves basically to walk back and to progress towards God. And finally, venial sin. Now, venial sin does not remove sanctifying grace or charity in the life of soul. It simply wounds it. It darkens it, makes it more difficult to function properly within the human person. It also, in doing so, weakens the use of the virtues. We haven't lost the virtues, but it becomes harder to use them. We haven't lost the gifts of the Holy Spirit. It just becomes harder to hear or to sense the promptings of the Holy Spirit. In addition, by committing venial sin, we are attaching ourselves to creatures. We're basically practicing sin and making it easier to sin. And so we incur the debt of temporal punishment, whereby we have to work against that attachment. We have to do things to make satisfaction and kind of remove that attachment towards temporal punishment through acts of charity, prayer, penance, and the like.